I held my unconscious newborn in my arms while my mother-in-law stood over me rubbing her stinging hand. She told me to get out so my husband could sleep. When I rushed my baby to the hospital, the emergency room doctor delivered news that made my blood run cold, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the fall. I picked up the phone to call the police, knowing it would instantly blow up my fake life as a struggling freelancer and unleash a financial bloodbath. My husband's family would never survive. My name is Sydney, 33 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday night, my husband's family thought I was nothing but a useless burden. It was exactly 2 in the morning when my 2-month-old daughter Lily started wailing from her bassinet. Before I could even finish warming her formula, my bedroom door flew open with such force it slammed against the drywall. My mother-in-law Brenda marched in, her face twisted in a vicious sneer. I opened my mouth to tell her I had it under control, but I never got the chance. Without a second of hesitation, Brenda swung her arm and struck me across the face so hard my vision temporarily blacked out. The sheer force of the slap sent me stumbling backward. My foot caught the edge of the rug and my arms instinctively flailed to catch my balance. In that fraction of a second, Lily slipped from my grasp. The sickening thud of her small body hitting the hardwood floor will haunt me for the rest of my life. Lily let out a sharp gasp, then went completely limp and silent. I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking as I scooped up my unconscious baby. I expected Brenda to panic, to call for an ambulance, to show a single ounce of human decency. Instead, she stood over me, rubbing her palm, and scoffed. "Shut her up or get out of the house. Gavin has a company to run tomorrow. If a freeloader like you cannot even quiet a baby, you are entirely useless." I looked toward the bed, desperately expecting my husband to jump up and defend his family. Gavin simply rolled over, pulling the heavy duvet over his ears. "Take her to the living room, Sydney. I have a massive pitch tomorrow and I cannot deal with this noise right now." For 4 years, I had played the part of the quiet, low-income freelance data entry clerk to keep the peace in this household. I let Gavin parade around Atlanta as the brilliant tech startup founder, completely unaware that the anonymous angel investor keeping his failing company afloat was actually my own limited liability corporation. I let Brenda live in a luxury house she thought her son paid for, enduring her daily insults about my modest wardrobe and my supposed lack of ambition. I tolerated it all because I wanted my daughter to have a complete family. But looking at Lily's pale, motionless face, the woman who had played the submissive wife died on that hardwood floor. I did not waste time crying. I did not scream or argue. I grabbed my car keys from the nightstand, wrapped Lily tightly in her fleece blanket, and sprinted down the stairs. The cold Atlanta night air hit my face as I backed my car out of the driveway, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I ran every red light down Peachtree Street, my knuckles turning white around the steering wheel, praying to any higher power that my baby would open her eyes. The emergency room at the pediatric hospital was a chaotic blur of bright fluorescent lights and rushing medical staff. They took Lily from my arms, immediately rushing her through a set of double doors, while I was left pacing the sterile waiting area. My cheeks still burned intensely from Brenda's hand, but I could only focus on those swinging doors. Every time a nurse walked past, my heart hammered against my ribs. I kept replaying the last few weeks in my head, trying to make sense of the escalating hostility in my own home. Brenda had always been controlling, but her recent behavior had crossed into a strange, aggressive territory, especially when it came to Lily. After an hour that felt like an eternity, a doctor finally stepped out. His face was grim, and he held a clipboard tightly against his chest. I rushed toward him, my voice barely a whisper, when I asked if my daughter was going to survive. The doctor looked at me with an expression that made my stomach drop entirely. "Your daughter is safe from the fall," he said quietly. "She only suffered a mild concussion and she is resting now." I let out a heavy breath. I felt like I had been holding for an hour, but the doctor held up his hand, his expression growing even more serious. "But that is not what is terrifying me right now, Sydney. We ran a full toxicology panel as a standard precaution. Her blood work shows a lethal dose of adult sedatives in her system. If she had not taken that fall and been brought in tonight, her heart would have stopped completely in her sleep." I stared at the doctor as the harsh hospital lights buzzed above us. Adult sedatives. The words repeated in my mind, slicing through the panic and replacing it with a cold, terrifying clarity. I thought about the past 2 weeks. I thought about how aggressively Brenda had taken over Lily's nighttime feedings. She had physically pushed me away from the kitchen counter, snatching the formula tin from my hands while calling me clumsy and neurotic. She told Gavin I was too anxious to do it right, and insisted she was the only one who knew how to properly put a fussy baby to sleep. It was never a motherly gesture. It was a calculated, vicious strategy. She had been systematically drugging my newborn daughter just so she would not be inconvenienced by a crying infant in the house. I did not collapse onto the sterile hospital floor. I did not burst into hysterical tears. I simply reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed 911. I stood right there in the pediatric hallway and spoke clearly to the dispatcher, reporting a deliberate poisoning and felony child abuse at my home address. Just as I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, the heavy double doors of the emergency ward slid open. Gavin marched down the hallway, looking completely exasperated rather than terrified for his child. Right behind him were his sister Brittany and her husband Trevon. Gavin saw me standing by the reception desk and immediately lunged forward, trying to snatch the phone from my pocket. I stepped back smoothly, letting his hand grasp empty air. He demanded to know who I was calling and why I was causing a massive public scene in the middle of the night. Before I could answer him, Trevon stepped up, adjusting the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. As the owner of a highly profitable chain of luxury car dealerships in Atlanta, Trevon always made sure everyone in the room knew exactly how much money he was wearing. He looked me up and down with a condescending smirk that made my blood boil. "You have seriously lost your mind this time," Trevon scoffed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Postpartum psychosis is hitting you hard, sis." Mom texted us on the way here. She said she only gave the kid a tiny drop of pediatric cough syrup because you were too incompetent to soothe her yourself. You are staging this whole dramatic hospital run to squeeze a massive alimony check out of Gavin, aren't you? Brittany rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her expensive designer jacket. You are so pathetic, Sydney. Anything to get attention and ruin Gavin's big pitch tomorrow morning. You could not just let him sleep, could you? I looked at the three of them, a family utterly devoid of empathy, actively defending a woman who had nearly killed an infant. Before I could verbally eviscerate them, two uniformed police officers walked through the ward doors responding to my dispatch call. But before I could even take a breath to address the officers, Brenda came rushing through the entrance right behind them. She must have driven her own car and practically chased the squad car to the hospital. The moment Brenda saw the police officers, she threw herself into the nearest waiting room chair and let out a theatrical, piercing wail. She clutched her chest, sobbing loudly with absolutely zero actual tears falling from her eyes. "Officers! Thank God you are here!" Brenda cried out, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "My daughter-in-law is completely unhinged. She has been losing her mind for weeks. Tonight she went into a manic rage. I tried to stop her, but she slapped her own face to leave a red mark through my precious granddaughter onto the hardwood floor and threatened to blame me for it if I did not leave the house." I watched in absolute disgust as Gavin immediately rushed to his mother's side, patting her shoulder in a show of comforting solidarity. He looked right at the police officers and lied through his teeth without a single ounce of hesitation. "It is true, officers. My wife has been dangerously unstable since the birth. My mother was just trying to protect the baby from her episode." Trevin nodded firmly, stepping closer to the officers to add his own fabricated testimony about my supposed mental decline, backing up Brenda's insane narrative completely. The taller police officer turned his gaze toward me. His expression was stern and uncompromising. He listened to the three people actively attacking my character, looked at the red handprint still glowing brightly on my cheek, and slowly reached onto his duty belt. The metallic clink of handcuffs echoing in the quiet hospital hallway was the only warning I got before he stepped directly into my personal space, pulling my arms behind my back. The heavy metal of the handcuffs brushed against my skin, sending a chill down my spine. The taller officer grabbed my left wrist, firmly twisting my arm behind my back. I did not struggle, nor did I raise my voice. I simply locked eyes with the officer and stood my ground. Officer, I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely steady. Before you make a career-ending mistake based on the word of a woman who just tried to murder a newborn, I highly suggest you look at the screen of the iPad in my bag. The officer hesitated, his grip loosening just a fraction. Trevon immediately scoffed loudly, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. Do not listen to her, man. She is delusional. Just book her and get her out of here so my mother-in-law can breathe. But the second officer had already unzipped the front pocket of my tote bag and pulled out the sleek silver tablet. I told him my passcode. I might play the part of a struggling freelance data entry clerk to this family, but my personal network was built with military-grade encryption. I tapped the home security application and pulled up the nursery camera feed from exactly 2 hours ago. I turned the brightness up and angled the high-definition screen so both officers, Gavin Trevon and Brittany, could see it perfectly. Watch closely, I instructed, pressing play and turning the volume all the way up. The footage was in crystal clear 4K resolution. The hospital hallway fell completely silent as the video started. There was Brenda sneaking into the dimly lit nursery. The camera caught her face perfectly as she pulled a plastic baggie from her pocket. The officers watched in stunned silence as she crushed 2 adult sedatives against the top of the dresser, sweeping the heavy powder directly into Lily's formula bottle and shaking it vigorously. Brittany gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Gavin stared at the screen, his jaw dropping open. But the video was not over. The footage skipped forward to the moment I was holding my crying baby. The audio picked up the sharp, violent crack of Brenda's hand striking my face. The sound echoed down the hospital corridor, making a nearby nurse stop in her tracks. Then came Brenda's voice, loud, vicious, and undeniably clear. Shut her up or get out of the house. Gavin has a company to run tomorrow. If a freeloader like you cannot even quiet a baby, you are entirely useless. Then the sickening thud of Lily hitting the floor played through the iPad speakers. In the video, Gavin could be heard groaning from the bed, complaining about his upcoming pitch and telling me to take the baby to the living room so he could sleep. The taller officer stared at the screen, his jaw set tightly. He immediately released my arm and took a step back. The air in the pediatric ward shifted instantly. The officers turned their gaze toward Brenda, whose theatrical fake tears had completely vanished. Her face was drained of all color, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave as he stepped directly toward my mother-in-law. "Put your hands behind your back right now," Brenda shrieked. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a metal medical cart and sending supplies clattering to the floor. "Gavin, do something," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the iPad. "It is a fake. She is a computer typist. She doctored that video to frame me. Tell them she made it up." But the police were not entertaining her pathetic lies anymore. The officer grabbed Brenda by the shoulders, spinning her around and forcing her arms behind her back. The sharp snap of the steel cuffs locking around her wrists was the most satisfying sound I had heard all night. "Brenda, you are under arrest for felony child abuse, intentional assault, and reckless endangerment," the second officer announced, reciting her rights as she thrashed and kicked against them. I watched with icy satisfaction as they dragged her down the sterile hospital hallway. She was being given a public perp walk right in front of half the pediatric staff, screaming for her golden boy son to save her. Gavin was hyperventilating. He watched his mother get shoved into the hospital elevator in handcuffs, and then he slowly turned his gaze back to me. His face was purple with an explosive, humiliated rage. His perfect reputation was crumbling, and he needed someone to punish. Trevon backed away suddenly, very quiet. The arrogant luxury car dealer realized that his flashy wealth and loud mouth could not argue with high-definition video evidence and angry cops. Brittany was sobbing loudly, clutching Trevon's arm as if the sky was falling. Gavin stepped directly into my personal space, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "You vicious, calculating witch!" he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "I will divorce you tomorrow morning. I am calling Human Resources and canceling your health insurance the second the sun comes up. I will take full custody of Lily, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing." He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my face. "You are a freelance typist, Sydney. You make pennies. You cannot afford a decent lawyer, let alone a pediatric intensive care hospital bill. You are going to be on the street begging me for mercy while my mother takes my daughter away from you." Gavin's arrogant laughter was still echoing in my ears, But he had no idea that his threats were about to be met with the cold reality of his own destruction. I looked at his red, angry face. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not beg for my marriage. Instead, I stood my ground and a slow, cold smirk spread across my face. "Are you sure about that, Trevon?" I asked, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. Trevon scoffed, though his posture stiffened just a fraction. He crossed his arms, the heavy gold Rolex catching the harsh hospital lighting. He looked at me like I was a joke, a desperate woman grasping at straws. He puffed out his chest, his custom-tailored suit stretching tightly across his shoulders. He was the king of his own little world, the untouchable owner of the most lucrative luxury car dealership chain in Atlanta. He thought his money made him invincible. "I am positive, Trevon," he sneered, looking down his nose at me. "You might have played some cute financial tricks on Gavin, but do not even try to step into my arena. I move millions of dollars in inventory every single month. I am not some struggling startup founder you can push around. I have real wealth. I have real lawyers. You are nothing but a bitter woman trying to ruin her husband because you cannot handle the stress of a newborn." I kept my eyes locked onto his, my expression entirely flat. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Last month, your flagship dealership on Peachtree Road applied for a massive commercial line of credit to expand your operations into Florida," I said, watching his smug smile falter slightly. "To secure that loan, the bank required an independent third-party compliance audit of your entire digital infrastructure and financial ledgers. You hired a top-tier firm to do the job, a firm called Apex Cybersec." Trevon uncrossed his arms. His eyes narrowed as the name of the company I had just revealed as my own finally registered in his brain. "You thought you were just hiring a bunch of anonymous tech geeks to rubber stamp your paperwork," I continued, my voice echoing coldly down the pediatric ward hallway. "You assumed the auditors would just run a basic software diagnostic and hand over a clean certificate. But I am the founder of Apex. I personally flagged your account when the contract came across my desk. I personally decrypted your private servers. I personally read your files, Trevon." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant, untouchable businessman was suddenly looking at me like I was holding a loaded weapon. I detailed exactly what I had found in those servers, making sure my voice carried clearly to Brittany and Gavin, who were standing frozen in shock. "You have been laundering money for 2 years," I stated, laying out his crimes with clinical precision. "You created an elaborate system of ghost inventory. You generated fake vehicle identification numbers and recorded sales for luxury cars that never actually existed. You used those fake sales to wash millions of dollars in dirty cash through your dealership, funneling the profits into offshore shell companies to evade federal taxes. You committed massive, systematic wire fraud and tax evasion right under the nose of the federal government." "That is a lie," Trevon stammered, his voice suddenly pitching higher. He looked around the hallway as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "You signed a non-disclosure agreement. You cannot legally access or discuss my private business records. I will sue you for everything you have." I actually smiled at that. A non-disclosure agreement is automatically invalidated when it is used to conceal an ongoing federal crime, Trevon. It is called the crime fraud exception. Not only was I legally permitted to break the confidentiality clause, but as a licensed financial auditor, I was legally obligated to report it. I did not just read your files, I compiled them. I organized every single fake invoice, every hidden offshore routing number, and every fraudulent tax return. And exactly 1 hour ago, while I was waiting for the doctor to tell me if my daughter was going to survive your mother-in-law poisoning her, I forwarded your unredacted ledgers to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Atlanta field office of the FBI. Trevon took a stumbling step backward. His face, usually brimming with arrogant confidence, turned an ashen shade of gray. He shook his head wildly, trying to reject reality. "You are bluffing!" he gasped, reaching into his pocket for his phone. "You are just trying to scare me. You do not have that kind of power." Right on cue, his smartphone began to vibrate violently in his hand. He looked down at the screen and I could see the caller identification flashing brightly. It was his general manager at the flagship showroom. Trevon answered the phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped the device. "Yeah," he whispered into the receiver. I did not need to be on the other end of the line to know exactly what he was being told. I watched Trevin's eyes widen in absolute horror. His knees literally buckled, forcing him to heavily drop into a plastic hospital chair against the wall. He sat there hyperventilating, staring blankly at the floor, as the voice on the other end of the phone delivered the final blow. Federal agents in windbreakers were currently swarming his dealership. The FBI and the IRS were chaining the doors shut, seizing all the luxury vehicles, confiscating the servers, and freezing every single corporate bank account tied to his name. His entire empire, built on fraud and arrogance, had been completely annihilated with a single email. Trevon dropped his phone. It clattered against the linoleum floor. He buried his face in his hands, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack overtook him. Brittany, who had been listening to this entire exchange in stunned silence, finally snapped. The reality that her endless shopping sprees, her designer handbags, and her luxurious lifestyle were permanently gone hit her all at once. She lunged toward me, her face twisted in a hysterical rage. "You ruined my life!" Brittany screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You planned this. You destroyed my husband to get back at us. How am I supposed to live? How am I supposed to pay my mortgage? You are a monster." I did not move an inch as she screamed in my face. "Your husband ruined his own life when he decided to commit federal crimes." "Brittany," I replied, my voice slicing through her hysteria like ice. "And you ruined yours when you decided to stand in this hospital and defend a woman who nearly killed my child. You should go home and start packing. The federal government is going to seize that mansion of yours before the end of the month." Brittany let out a loud, pathetic sob and sank down next to Trevon, burying her face in his shoulder. The two people who had mocked me just 10 minutes ago were now completely broken, stripped of their wealth, their status, and their future. I turned my attention back to my husband. Gavin was standing against the opposite wall, watching his entire support system get dismantled with terrifying efficiency. He realized in that exact moment that he had absolutely no money, no power, and no leverage left. His startup was bankrupt, his mother was in handcuffs, and his wealthy brother-in-law was headed for a federal penitentiary. But Gavin was a coward who refused to accept defeat. He looked at my cold, calculated demeanor, and I saw a desperate, dangerous idea form in his eyes. He pulled his phone from his pocket, backing away from me as he dialed a number. I was not calling a lawyer. He was calling Child Protective Services. "I want to report an immediate danger to an infant," Gavin said into the phone, his voice shaking but filled with a sudden malicious energy. "I am at the pediatric hospital. My wife has suffered a complete mental break. She is a sociopathic corporate tyrant who just destroyed my family out of pure spite. She is utterly lacking in empathy, she is mentally unfit to parent, and I believe she poses an immediate severe threat to the safety of our newborn daughter. Send an agent right now." Less than 30 minutes after Gavin made that desperate, malicious phone call, the heavy double doors of the pediatric ward swung open once again. A woman carrying a thick clipboard and wearing an expression of absolute, unwavering authority marched down the hallway. She identified herself as an agent with Child Protective Services. Gavin did not miss a single beat. He immediately rushed over to her, playing the part of the terrified, exhausted, and heartbroken father to absolute perfection. He handed the agent a stack of printed papers he had pulled from his briefcase. He claimed they were my official psychiatric records. In reality, they were heavily doctored notes from a brief stint in couples counseling we had attended 2 years ago. Gavin had completely twisted the therapist's words, removing all context to paint me as a deeply paranoid schizophrenic who suffered from violent, unpredictable delusions. He stood right there in the sterile hospital corridor, wiping away fake tears, telling the Child Protective Services agent that I was a severe danger to myself and our newborn daughter. He claimed my accusations against his mother were nothing but a psychotic break, a hallucination brought on by postpartum depression and severe mental illness. The agent turned her sharp, calculating gaze toward me. Her posture was rigid, her face unreadable. She asked me to step away from the door leading to the nursery where Lily was resting. She demanded to know if I had a history of psychiatric hospitalization, her tone implying that she already believed every single lie my husband had just fed her. I knew exactly what Gavin was trying to do. If I raised my voice, if I yelled, if I showed even a fraction of the immense rage boiling inside my chest, I would give them exactly what they needed. I would look like the hysterical, unhinged woman Gavin claimed I was. So I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply reached into the bottom of my heavy leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, sealed manila folder. I walked over and handed it directly to the agent, the heavy thud of the paper echoing between us. I looked the agent right in the eye and told her that my husband was indeed a phenomenal storyteller, but his fiction lacked actual verifiable evidence. I explained in a perfectly steady, even voice that I was not a paranoid schizophrenic experiencing a postpartum mental break. I was a highly trained financial auditor who had spent the last 6 months tracking my husband's very real, very calculated exit strategy. Gavin scoffed loudly, trying to interrupt, telling the agent not to listen to my crazy conspiracy theories. But the agent held up her hand to silence him and opened the folder. Inside was not a medical history. It was a comprehensive, undeniable financial dossier. I watched her eyes scan the highlighted documents, her professional demeanor faltering as she realized exactly what she was holding. I explained exactly what she was looking at. The first few pages were bank statements showing Gavin illegally funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his tech startup into a hidden offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. Next were the signed lease agreements for a luxury penthouse apartment in downtown Atlanta. An apartment completely paid for, under a fake corporate, alias that Gavin had set up 3 months before Lily was even born. I did not stop there. I pointed out the itemized credit card receipts for diamond necklaces, expensive dinners, and luxury vacations that Gavin had taken while supposedly away on corporate business trips. I told the agent that Gavin was not a terrified father trying to protect his child from an unstable mother. He was a bankrupt, cheating fraud who had spent the entire duration of my pregnancy planning to abandon his wife and newborn daughter so he could run away with his 26-year-old mistress. He only called the authorities as a desperate last-minute retaliation because I had just uncovered his crimes and frozen every single penny of his stolen money. The agent looked from the damning financial documents to Gavin. The sympathetic look she had given him just moments ago completely vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. She realized instantly that she was being used as a pawn in a malicious divorce tactic by a desperate man. Gavin's face went completely pale as the agent flipped through the undeniable proof of his double life. He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to form a pathetic excuse about how the documents were forged. But before he could even get a full sentence out, a sharp, rhythmic sound interrupted him. The loud, aggressive clicking of high heels echoed down the quiet hospital hallway. A young woman with long blonde hair, wearing a tight designer dress and carrying a wildly expensive handbag, marched furiously toward us. It was Amber, Gavin's secret girlfriend. The woman who thought she was dating a self-made tech billionaire. The woman who had been living in the luxury penthouse I had just exposed. She did not even look at me. She ignored the police officers still standing nearby. She completely ignored the agent holding the folder. Amber marched right up to Gavin, her face twisted in absolute unfiltered rage, and screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know why every single one of his unlimited black credit cards was suddenly declining at all the designer boutiques across the city. Amber's voice echoed sharply against the sterile hospital walls as she waved a handful of useless plastic credit cards in Gavin's face. Gavin scrambled forward, his eyes darting frantically between his mistress, the Child Protective Services agent, and the police officers still lingering in the corridor. He grabbed Amber by the elbow, desperately trying to pull her away, and hissing at her to keep her voice down. He tried to claim it was a banking error, a simple misunderstanding with his wealth manager. But Amber was not having it. She shoved him off, shouting that she had just been humiliated at a designer boutique when every single account tied to his name came back frozen. I stepped forward, my posture relaxed, but completely commanding. I looked the 26-year-old mistress up and down, noting the expensive jewelry and the designer dress I had unknowingly paid for. "There is no banking error, Amber," I said smoothly, letting my voice carry across the tension-filled hallway. I introduced myself, watching her angry expression morph into total shock as she realized she was standing face to face with the wife. Gavin tried to shout over me, begging the CPS agent to ignore the crazy women in the hallway, but I did not stop. Gavin is not a self-made tech billionaire. I explained to Amber, laying out the brutal reality with absolute precision. He does not own that luxury penthouse you have been living in. He does not even own the company he brags about. For the past 4 years, my private corporation has been the sole angel investor, keeping his pathetic startup afloat. And exactly 2 hours ago, I pulled every single dime of my funding and executed an immediate debt recall. Gavin is entirely bankrupt. Worse, he has been illegally funneling money through offshore accounts tied to his brother-in-law, whose dealership is currently being raided by federal agents. Gavin is broke, and by tomorrow morning he is going to be indicted for federal wire fraud. Amber stared at me, the blood completely draining from her face. She looked at Gavin, who was sweating profusely and unable to form a single coherent sentence to defend himself. The reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. She was living in an apartment leased under a fraudulent corporate, alias driving a car bought with laundered money and wearing jewelry purchased through stolen funds. I took a step closer to her, lowering my voice just enough to make it a private negotiation. When the federal government seizes Gavin's assets, they are going to look at everyone connected to his fake shell companies, I told her. That includes you. You are going to be dragged into a massive federal indictment as an accomplice. But I am willing to offer you a way out right now. Amber swallowed hard, her eyes wide with panic. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling. I want the key to Gavin's private safe deposit box, I said firmly. I know he keeps it at the penthouse because he is too careless to hide it anywhere else. You give me that key, and I will have my corporate legal team grant you full immunity from the upcoming financial fallout. You get to walk away clean and keep everything in your closet. Gavin lunged forward, screaming at Amber not to listen to me, but he was too late. Amber did not hesitate for a single second. She unzipped her wildly expensive handbag, dug her hand inside, and pulled out a heavy brass key on a silver ring. She tossed it directly into my waiting hand. Gavin let out a furious yell, raising his hand as if he might actually try to grab her. Amber did not back down. Instead, she squared her shoulders and delivered a phenomenal, echoing slap directly across Gavin's face. The sharp crack mirrored the exact sound of the slap Brenda had given me earlier that night. You are a broke, pathetic liar. Amber spat at him, her voice dripping with disgust. Have fun in prison. She turned on her heel and marched right back down the hospital hallway, leaving Gavin clutching his reddening cheek in absolute disbelief. He looked like a cornered rat, his entire secret life demolished in less than 5 minutes. The Child Protective Services agent, who had watched this entire spectacular confrontation unfold, simply sighed. She looked from the undeniable financial dossier in her hands to the humiliated, cheating husband standing in front of her. With a loud, definitive snap, she closed her clipboard. Mr. Gavin, the agent said, her voice laced with heavy professional disdain. It is abundantly clear that you attempted to use this agency to weaponize a false psychiatric claim against your wife in a desperate bid to hide your own criminal and moral failings. I am dismissing this investigation entirely, and I will be recommending that the local prosecutor file charges against you for submitting a malicious false report regarding a child's safety. She turned to me, her expression softening into one of profound respect. You are cleared, ma'am. Go be with your daughter. Gavin fell to his knees in the middle of the hallway, utterly defeated, completely broke, and entirely alone. I did not give him a second glance. I turned my back on him and walked straight toward the nursery to check on Lily. She was sleeping peacefully, her vital signs perfectly stable, safely guarded by the pediatric nurses. Knowing my child was secure, I gripped the brass safe deposit box key in my pocket. I needed to know exactly what Gavin had been hiding in that bank vault. I informed the nursing staff that I would be back shortly and made my way toward the hospital exit. The automatic glass doors slid open, letting the cool night air hit my face. Just as I stepped onto the pavement, my phone vibrated violently in my pocket. It was an urgent encrypted text message from the head of my private security detail. I stopped walking as I read the alert. My heart skipped a beat, then hammered furiously against my ribs. Brenda had somehow managed to make bail. She had used one of Trayvon's last remaining clean offshore accounts before the federal freeze hit his entire network. But that was not the terrifying part. My security team was warning me that Brenda was currently tracking my exact live location, and her vehicle was speeding aggressively toward my position. I stared at the encrypted text message on my phone, the glowing screen illuminating the dark hospital parking lot. Brenda had managed to post bail using one of Trayvon's final offshore accounts before the federal freeze hit his entire network. But the alert from my private security detail did not make me panic. It said my mother-in-law was tracking my phone's location and speeding aggressively toward me. I actually smiled. If Brenda wanted a war, I was more than happy to give her the battlefield. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car and told my driver to head directly to First Republic Trust in downtown Atlanta. I also sent a quick message to my security team instructing them to stand down and let her through. I wanted Brenda to dig her own grave. First Republic Trust was not a standard retail bank. It was an exclusive financial institution reserved for high-net-worth individuals and massive corporate entities. As the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Cybersec, I was one of their most valuable clients. When I walked through the towering glass doors, the bank manager immediately stepped out of his office to greet me personally. The armed security guards dressed in tailored suits gave me respectful nods. I asked the manager for immediate access to the private vault, presenting the heavy brass key Amber had thrown at me. He nodded, gesturing for me to follow him. But before we could even take 10 steps across the expansive polished marble floor, the heavy front doors burst open with a violent crash. Brenda stormed into the grand lobby. She looked absolutely unhinged. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and stained with sweat from her time in a holding cell. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, explosive rage. She spotted me standing near the vault entrance and let out a guttural, terrifying scream. "You ruined my family!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the bank. "You destroyed my son. You set up Trayvon. I am going to kill you." Brenda charged across the marble floor, completely ignoring the shocked gasps of the wealthy clients and bank tellers. She raised her hands, her manicured nails curled like claws, aiming directly for my face. I did not flinch. I did not step back in fear. I waited until she was less than 2 feet away, fueled entirely by blind momentum, and I simply took one smooth, calculated step to the right. Brenda lunged at empty air. Before she could even correct her balance, the bank's highly trained armed security guards descended on her like a tidal wave. They knew exactly who I was, and they were not going to let a deranged woman assault a top-tier client in their lobby. 2 massive guards tackled Brenda hard, driving her straight into the cold, polished floor. The impact knocked the wind completely out of her. "Get your hands off me!" Brenda gasped, thrashing wildly under the weight of the security guards. "My son is a tech CEO. Do you know who I am?" One of the guards effortlessly pinned her arms behind her back, zip tying her wrists together in a matter of seconds. "You are a trespasser attempting to assault our client," the guard replied coldly. "And the police are already on their way." I stood over her, looking down at her pathetic, struggling form. "You really are not very bright, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You just posted bail for felony child abuse less than an hour ago. By tracking my location and attempting to physically assault me in a public space, you just violated every single condition of your release. You are not going back to a holding cell. You are going straight to a maximum security county jail, and Gavin does not have a single penny left to bail you out a second time." The siren of an approaching police cruiser wailed outside the bank doors. Brenda began to sob, hysterically realizing the catastrophic, irreversible mistake she had just made. As the Atlanta police officers hauled her thrashing, screaming body out of the bank lobby, I calmly smoothed out the front of my jacket and turned back to the bank manager. "I believe I was heading to the vault," I said politely. The manager, still slightly pale from the commotion, quickly escorted me behind the reinforced steel doors of the private vault area. He left me alone in a small, secure viewing room with the heavy metal deposit box I had requested. I slid Gavin's brass key into the lock and turned it. The heavy lid popped open. I expected to find stacks of emergency cash, maybe the deeds to the shell companies, or the offshore routing numbers Amber had mentioned at the hospital. There was indeed a thick stack of $100 bills banded together in the corner. But that was not what caught my attention. Sitting right in the center of the metal box was a thick white envelope bearing the logo of a highly exclusive private genetics laboratory in Atlanta. The word paternity was stamped across the front in bold red ink. My brow furrowed. I broke the seal and pulled out the thick stack of medical papers. I began reading the clinical summary, my eyes scanning the highlighted sections. What I found inside did not just reveal stolen money or hidden assets. It was a highly classified secret DNA test report involving Brenda Gavin and my newborn daughter, Lily. And the results printed on the very last page contained a biological revelation so massive and so twisted, it was going to blow Gavin's entire arrogant existence completely off the map. I pulled the thick stack of premium paper from the envelope. The header displayed the name of an elite private diagnostics laboratory here in Atlanta. I scanned the first page and my blood ran completely cold. It was a strict chain of custody log for genetic material. My eyes locked onto the names listed on the submission form. Gavin had ordered a secret paternity test. My own husband was so insecure and so incredibly paranoid about my long hours working in my home office that he actually convinced himself I was having an affair. He genuinely believed Lily was not his daughter. I flipped to the next page and felt a wave of absolute nausea crash over me. Attached to the laboratory report was a handwritten invoice and a medical consent form signed by Brenda. She was the one who collected the genetic sample from my baby. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. The heavy sedatives the pediatric doctors found in Lily at the hospital were not an isolated incident. Brenda had drugged my newborn daughter weeks ago, just to keep her completely unconscious, while she forcefully extracted blood and plucked hair follicles for this illicit test. The cruelty required to do that to an infant was unfathomable. I moved my trembling hands to the results page. The genetic markers confirmed the truth. Gavin was the biological father with a 99.9% certainty. But there was a second section to the extensive report. Gavin had apparently ordered a comprehensive familial lineage panel alongside the paternity test to check for hereditary health conditions. To establish a medical baseline, he had submitted a cheek swab from his mother. The laboratory had flagged a massive genetic anomaly in bold red text at the bottom of the page, and Brenda shared absolutely zero DNA. I stared at the page, reading the words over and over again. Gavin was not her biological son. I dug much deeper into the heavy metal safe deposit box and pulled out a stack of yellowed aged documents clipped tightly together. They were highly classified reports from a private investigator hired by Gavin's late father over 30 years ago. The truth spelled out on those fragile pages was monstrous. Brenda had never been pregnant. She had faked her entire pregnancy to trap Gavin's incredibly wealthy father into a binding marriage. When the time came to deliver, she used her connections at a highly corrupt private clinic to essentially buy a newborn baby from a desperate teenage girl. She passed Gavin off as her own flesh and blood, presenting him as the sole heir to a massive corporate dynasty. Brenda had stolen a child just to secure her status as a high society matriarch. Everything finally made sense. Everything Brenda did was to protect her massive criminal lie. Her entire life was a fragile illusion built on fraud and kidnapping. She controlled Gavin with an iron fist because he was her one and only claim to the family fortune. She hated me from the moment we met because I was smart and highly observant, and she lived in constant fear that I would eventually see through her wealthy facade. Gavin clearly found these investigator files after his father passed away. He hid them in this bank vault to protect his own inheritance. He knew his mother was a total fraud, and they were both living in a state of mutually assured destruction, manipulating each other just to keep the stolen money flowing. I carefully folded the laboratory reports and the private investigator files, slipping them securely into the hidden pocket of my leather tote bag. I walked out of the private viewing room and exited the bank, leaving Brenda to rot in her maximum security jail cell. I climbed back into my waiting town car and told my driver to take me straight home to my daughter. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting a golden glow over the city I was about to completely conquer. I spent the entire weekend finalizing my endgame strategy. I worked alongside my corporate legal team to draft the ultimate financial eviction notice. By Monday morning, I was ready to strike. Trevon had somehow managed to post a massive federal bond, emptying the very last of his hidden cash reserves just to stay out of a prison cell temporarily. Brittany was living in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, crying over her seized mansion and her frozen credit cards. Gavin was sleeping on a friend's couch, completely paralyzed by his impending wire fraud indictment and terrified of his looming poverty. I sent a single highly encrypted email to all three of them. I offered them a mandatory meeting at my corporate headquarters. I titled the email as a final divorce and financial settlement negotiation. I knew they were absolutely desperate. I knew they were terrified of going to federal prison and would crawl through broken glass if they thought I might offer them a financial lifeline or a lenient plea deal. They had no idea they were walking directly into a slaughterhouse. I summoned Gavin, Brittany, and Trevon to the Grand Executive Boardroom on the top floor of the Apex Cybersec building. They thought they could sit across from me and bargain for their pathetic, ruined lives. They had no idea I held the biological weapon that was going to obliterate their entire family tree. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table on the top floor of the Apex Cybersec headquarters. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind me offered a stunning panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a perfectly dominant backdrop for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. Directly across from me sat Gavin, Brittany, and Trevon. They looked like pathetic hollow shadows of the arrogant monsters who had mocked me in the hospital just a few days ago. Trevon was sweating profusely through a cheap, off-the-rack shirt, having been completely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and flashy Rolex after draining his final hidden accounts to post his federal bond. Brittany looked entirely unhinged. Her expensive hair extensions were a tangled mess, her designer makeup was heavily smeared around her exhausted eyes, and her posture radiated pure, unadulterated panic. Gavin, however, was still desperately trying to cling to his shattered ego. He shifted in his plush leather chair and adjusted his collar in a laughable attempt to project authority. He actually believed he still had a card to play. "Listen to me very closely." Sydney Gavin started trying to make his shaking voice sound commanding. "I am willing to keep this divorce completely quiet. I will not go to the press and I will not drag your precious company through a messy public trial. But in exchange, I want 50% of your corporate assets, complete immunity from any financial lawsuits regarding my startup and joint custody of Lily. You sign the papers today, and we can all walk away from this nightmare." I did not blink. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee and gently placed the ceramic mug onto the polished wooden table. "We are not here to negotiate a divorce settlement, Gavin," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the cavernous room. "We are here because I found the heavy brass key your mistress threw at me in the hospital. I visited your private safe deposit box at First Republic Trust." Gavin froze. All the remaining color instantly drained from his face. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely failed him. I picked up a small silver remote from the table and pressed a single button. The lights in the boardroom dimmed automatically, and a massive high-definition projector screen descended from the ceiling directly behind me. I pressed another button, and the crisp, highly classified pages of a private genetics laboratory report flashed onto the screen in towering, undeniable text. Brittany squinted at the projected image, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" she demanded, looking from the screen to her brother. "This is the secret DNA panel your brother ordered behind my back," I explained, looking right at Brittany. Gavin was so deeply insecure and paranoid that he actually convinced himself my daughter was not his. "So he had your mother drug my newborn baby with adult sedatives, specifically to knock her out long enough to extract blood and hair follicles for a paternity test." Brittany gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Trevon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom as if calculating his escape route. "The good news is that the test confirmed Gavin is indeed Lily's biological father," I continued smoothly. "But Gavin is an incredibly thorough man. When he submitted his own genetic material, he also submitted a cheek swab he secretly took from Brenda, requesting a full familial health baseline." I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in on the final page of the laboratory report, highlighting a massive block of bold red text. "I want you to read that red paragraph very carefully, Brittany," I instructed. Brittany leaned forward, her eyes scanning the projected medical document. She read the words once, then twice, her breathing growing ragged and shallow. She slowly turned her head to look at Gavin, her expression contorting from confusion into absolute blinding horror. 0%. Brittany whispered, her voice trembling violently. It says you and Mom share 0% genetic material. I clicked the remote one final time, bringing up the scanned yellowing pages of the private investigator reports I had found at the very bottom of the safe deposit box. Your mother never gave birth to Gavin, I announced to the silent room. 35 years ago, Brenda faked her entire pregnancy to trap your extremely wealthy father into marriage. She used her connections at a corrupt private clinic to buy a newborn infant from a desperate teenager. She brought that stolen child home and presented him to your father as his firstborn son and the primary heir to his corporate dynasty. Gavin is not your brother Brittany. He is a total stranger purchased to secure a multi-million-dollar fortune. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the gears turning in Brittany's mind. She realized in that exact moment that the golden child, the son who had received the lion's share of their late father's massive trust fund, the man sitting right next to her, was a complete and utter fraud. She realized her mother had lied to her every single day of her entire life, stealing her rightful inheritance to give to a purchased stranger. Brittany completely snapped. A primal blood-curdling scream ripped from her throat. She vaulted over the heavy mahogany table with terrifying speed, launching herself directly at Gavin. She crashed into him, sending his heavy leather chair tipping backward onto the carpet. Brittany began clawing frantically at Gavin's face, striking his chest and screaming that he had stolen her father's money. Trevon, who had been sitting in paralyzed shock, suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. His wife's family fortune was the only thing that could potentially pay his mounting federal legal fees. With Gavin exposed as a fraud, that money was entirely illegitimate. Trevon leaped out of his chair, grabbing Gavin by the collar of his shirt and yanking him upward, joining his wife in a violent, chaotic assault. "You stole my life!" Brittany shrieked, kicking wildly as Gavin desperately tried to shield his bleeding face. "You and that monster took everything from me." The three of them thrashed across the floor of my elegant boardroom, destroying decades of false family unity in a matter of seconds. I simply sat in my chair, watching the people who had abused me tear each other to absolute shreds. Finally, Gavin managed to shove Trevon backward. He scrambled to his feet, his designer shirt ripped open, dark red scratches trailing down his cheek and neck. He backed away, panting heavily, pointing a shaking finger at his so-called sister. "It does not matter!" Gavin screamed, his voice cracking with desperate, manic denial. "It does not matter what the blood test says. I was legally recognized as his son. The trust fund is legally in my name. I still control my late father's estate, and you two get absolutely nothing." Right as the words left his mouth, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the boardroom swung wide open. An older, distinguished gentleman carrying a pristine leather briefcase stepped confidently into the room. He took one look at the bleeding, disheveled man backed into the corner and offered a cold, highly professional smile. "Actually, Gavin, you do not," the estate lawyer stated clearly, adjusting his silver-framed glasses. "Sydney does." "Actually, Gavin, you do not. Sydney does." The voice belonged to Mr. Pierce, the senior estate attorney, who had managed the family fortune for over 3 decades. He stepped fully into the boardroom, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression completely devoid of sympathy. He placed his pristine leather briefcase on the mahogany table and looked directly at my cheating, arrogant husband. Gavin wiped a streak of blood from his scratched cheek, his eyes wide with desperate confusion. "Pierce, what are you doing here? Tell this sociopath that my father left the estate to me. I am the sole beneficiary. Throw her out of my building." Mr. Pierce did not even blink. He calmly popped the brass latches of his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in heavy blue cardstock. "This is not your building, Gavin," Mr. Pierce said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "And you are not the sole beneficiary. In fact, you the past 4 years." Brittany stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, staring at the lawyer in stunned silence. "Your late father, Jonathan, was many things, but he was not a fool," Mr. Pierce continued, turning his attention to the projector screen that still displayed the damning DNA results. "He knew Brenda was a master manipulator long before he passed away. He also knew that you, Gavin, possessed absolutely zero financial literacy. He watched you blow through your initial inheritance on flashy cars and failed business ventures. He knew that if he left the primary estate in your hands, you would bankrupt the family within a decade. Gavin gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. I am his son. He signed the papers giving me the trust. I saw them. He signed a revocable allowance, I corrected sharply, stepping forward to stand right next to Mr. Pierce. When I married into this family, your father saw right through my quiet data entry act. He recognized my background in cybersecurity and financial auditing. We had a long private conversation in his study just 3 months before his heart failed. He knew exactly what Apex Cybersec was, and he knew I was the only person capable of protecting his legacy from your mother's greed and your sheer incompetence. Mr. Pierce slid the blue-bound documents across the table. Jonathan secretly restructured the entire family trust. He named Sydney as the sole proxy and chief executor of the estate. The money you thought was your startup revenue, the funds you thought you were drawing from your inheritance, all of it was carefully meted out to you by Sydney. She holds the keys to the kingdom, Gavin. The trust is completely irrevocable. The reality of the situation crashed down on Gavin and Brittany with the force of a falling building. Effective immediately, your access to the family funds is permanently revoked, I announced, my voice slicing through the silent boardroom. Brittany, your monthly trust payouts are frozen. The luxury condo you thought you were going to inherit is now fully under my corporate control. Gavin, every single corporate account tied to the trust has been seized. You are completely destitute and you are facing a massive federal indictment for wire fraud. Brittany let out a hollow, agonizing gasp. She grabbed her designer hair extensions, pulling at them as she sank to her knees on the expensive carpet. She had lost her mansion to the federal government this morning, and now she had lost her entire family inheritance. She was penniless. Gavin hyperventilated, his chest heaving, as he stared at the legal documents proving his utter ruin. He lunged forward, slamming his fists onto the mahogany table. You cannot do this to me. I will fight this in court. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years. With what money? Mr. Pierce asked, plainly shutting his briefcase. You cannot even afford a public defender at this point. While Gavin screamed in impotent rage and Brittany wailed on the floor, I did not notice the quiet movement at the back of the room. Trevon, who had been sitting in paralyzed silence, finally realized the absolute gravity of his situation. He had just emptied his very last clean offshore bank account to post his federal bail. He had come to this meeting banking on Brittany's trust fund to pay for his elite defense lawyers, and more importantly, to fund his immediate escape from the country before the FBI officially indicted him. Now, with the trust fund locked away by my signature, Trevon was a dead man walking. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for money laundering, and he had zero cash left to run. Like a cornered, desperate animal, Trevon slowly backed away from the table. While his wife sobbed and his brother-in-law argued pointlessly with the estate lawyer, Trevon slipped through the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom completely unnoticed. I stood tall at the head of the table, feeling a profound, chilling sense of victory. I had systematically dismantled the arrogant monsters who had abused me and nearly killed my daughter. I had stripped them of their wealth, their status, and their fake family legacy. They were finally paying the ultimate price for their cruelty. Then a sharp blaring alarm erupted from my jacket pocket. It was not a standard ringtone. It was the high-priority red alert emergency notification tied directly to my encrypted private security network. I quickly pulled out my phone, my triumphant smile vanishing instantly. The text message was from the head of the elite security detail I had hired to guard the pediatric ward where Lily was recovering from her concussion. The message chilled me to the very bone. Alpha team compromised. 2 guards knocked out in the south corridor. Suspect matching Trevon's description has breached the maternity wing lockdown. He is heavily armed and heading straight for Lily's room. My blood turned to ice. Trevon had no money, no leverage, and the federal government breathing down his neck. But he knew I had billions of dollars in liquid assets. He was not running away. He was going to the hospital to kidnap my newborn daughter for a massive ransom to fund his escape. The notification on my screen stared back at me, a glowing red warning that made my blood turn to absolute ice. My top-tier security detail had been neutralized. Trevon was heavily armed and currently hunting for my newborn daughter. I did not scream. I did not waste a single second explaining the situation to the pathetic, ruined people still sobbing inside my boardroom. I simply spun around, slammed the heavy mahogany doors behind me, and sprinted down the executive hallway. I hit the emergency stairwell, ignoring the elevators, and ran down 3 flights of stairs to the private executive garage where my armored SUV was waiting. I jumped into the back seat and ordered my driver to get me to Atlanta General Hospital as fast as physically possible. "Do not stop for lights," I commanded, my voice devoid of any panic. "Use the emergency sirens, go." As the heavy SUV lurched forward, tires screaming against the polished concrete of the garage, I flipped open my encrypted laptop. I did not need to hope the police would get there in time. I did not need to rely on the hospital's basic security guards. 2 years ago, Apex Cybersec had been contracted to completely overhaul the digital infrastructure and physical security grids for Atlanta General Hospital. I literally owned the architecture of the building's mainframe. I knew every digital backdoor, every zero-day exploit, and every single line of code that controlled that facility. My fingers flew across the keyboard with lethal precision. I bypassed the standard login portals, routed my connection through a dummy server in Europe to avoid triggering the hospital's internal alarms, and directly accessed the master control system. Within 40 seconds, I had total unrestricted administrative control of the entire hospital network. I pulled up the live high-definition security feeds for the pediatric and maternity wings. My eyes darted across the grid of camera feeds until my heart slammed violently against my ribs. There he was. On camera Sector 4, I saw Trevin sprinting frantically down the sterile white hallway. His designer shirt was torn, he was sweating profusely, and his eyes were wide with the manic desperation of a cornered animal facing decades in federal prison. In one hand, he gripped a heavy black handgun. In his other hand, he was forcefully pushing a clear plastic hospital bassinet. Inside that bassinet was Lily. She was wrapped in her pink swaddle, completely helpless. A primal, suffocating rage erupted in my chest, but I forced it down, channeling every ounce of my maternal terror into cold, calculated action. Trevin was making a break for the south stairwell, clearly intending to take my baby to the underground parking garage where he could steal a vehicle and vanish. I was never going to let him take another step. I typed a rapid sequence of commands into my terminal, overriding the hospital's standard emergency protocols. I did not just trigger a code pink. I initiated a total catastrophic cyber lockdown of the entire pediatric wing. On my screen, I watched the results of my keystrokes happen in real time. The standard fluorescent lights in the hallway instantly shut off, replaced by flashing, harsh red emergency strobes. Deafening warning sirens began blaring through the corridor. But most importantly, the heavy reinforced steel blast doors at the end of the hallway suddenly dropped from the ceiling, slamming into the floor with an impenetrable thud. The magnetic locks on every single exit engaged simultaneously, sealing the wing like a bank vault. Trevin skidded to a halt. He looked around in absolute panic as the steel doors blocked his escape route. He kicked the reinforced glass of a nearby exit, but it did not even crack. He was boxed in. I watched him frantically scan the flashing red hallway. His eyes landed on a pair of gray metal doors, halfway down the corridor. It was a service elevator, an older, manually operated transport lift, used by the janitorial staff. Because it was an older analog system, its doors had not been magnetically sealed by my digital lockdown. Trevin shoved his gun into his waistband, grabbed the bassinet, and kicked the service doors open. He shoved Lily's stroller inside the small metallic space and furiously mashed the button for the basement level. I quickly switched my feed to the security camera mounted directly inside that specific elevator car. I watched the doors slide shut, locking Trevin and my daughter inside a moving steel cage. He leaned against the wall, panting heavily, believing he had just found his escape route. I was incredibly wrong. I accessed the central power grid controls for the hospital's mechanical shafts. I highlighted the specific power relay routing electricity to service elevator number 3. I did not hesitate. I hit the execution key and completely severed the power supply to the winch motor. On the camera feed, the elevator violently jolted to a halt. The sudden aggressive stop knocked Trevin completely off his feet. The main lights inside the car died instantly, leaving him bathed in the eerie dim glow of the backup battery light. He scrambled up from the floor, his face twisted in pure terror, trapped, suspended in a dark shaft somewhere between the second and third floors. My SUV violently hopped the curb outside Atlanta General Hospital, screeching to a halt right in front of the emergency room entrance. I left the laptop in the car and sprinted through the sliding glass doors, flashing my top-tier corporate identification badge to the frantic hospital staff. I bypassed the chaos in the lobby and marched directly into the hospital's central security hub. The security guards were running around in a panic, trying to figure out why their entire system had been hijacked. I walked straight up to the master console, pushed the lead guard aside, and tapped the screen to activate the two-way intercom wired directly into service elevator number 3. I leaned close to the microphone, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "You have absolutely nowhere to run." "Trevin," I said, my voice echoing through the small speaker inside the trapped elevator car. "Put the gun down on the floor and step away from my daughter." On the screen, Trevon jumped, staring wildly at the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He pulled the gun from his waistband, his chest heaving with panic. He grabbed the edge of Lily's bassinet, pulling it dangerously close to him. "Sydney," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical desperation. "You listen to me. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. The feds took my dealership. Your company took my money. I am going to prison for the rest of my life, and I am not going down alone." He pointed the weapon toward the camera, his hand shaking violently. "You are a billionaire," Sydney Trevon shouted into the intercom. "You wire $5 million into my untraceable offshore crypto wallet right this second. You turn the power to this elevator back on, and you clear my path to the garage. If I see a single police officer, or if this money does not hit my account in 2 minutes, I swear I will hurt this kid. Do you understand me? $5 million right now." I stood in the security room, my nails digging into the console. My baby was trapped in a metal box with an armed, desperate fugitive. I had the money. I could easily wire him the $5 million in a heartbeat, but I knew if I opened those elevator doors, he would use Lily as a human shield the entire way out. I took a deep breath, preparing to negotiate, preparing to manipulate him just long enough for the SWAT team to arrive. But before I could speak a single word into the microphone, the intercom system crackled loudly with harsh static. A second audio line suddenly patched into the hospital's emergency frequency. Someone had forcefully hijacked the external communication line. A sharp, familiar voice echoed through the speakers, cutting right through Trevon's panicked breathing. "Do not give him a single penny, Sydney," the voice demanded. I stared at the console in absolute shock. Trevon froze in the elevator, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was Brittany. The sharp, familiar voice of my sister-in-law echoed through the hospital security room speakers. It cut right through the heavy static and completely paralyzed Trevon inside the stalled elevator car. "Do not give him a single penny," Sydney, Brittany demanded. I stared at the blinking audio channel on the master console. Brittany had bypassed the hospital switchboard by calling the direct emergency line, a number she only knew because Trevon used to supply the hospital executives with luxury vehicles. She must have seen the breaking news about the hospital lockdown or tracked the police scanners from her cheap motel room. Trevon looked up at the elevator security camera, his eyes wide with absolute betrayal. The heavy handgun trembled in his grip as he stared at the small speaker mounted in the corner of the steel ceiling. "Brittany, what are you doing?" Trevon yelled, his voice cracking under the sheer panic of the situation. "I am trying to get us the money. I am trying to save our lives before the feds lock me away forever." Brittany let out a harsh, bitter laugh that vibrated through the intercom. "You are not trying to save me, Trevon. You drained my last clean offshore account to post your federal bail, and then you left me sitting in a filthy motel while you planned to flee the country without me. You ruined my entire life. You lost my mansion, you lost the dealership, and now I have absolutely nothing because of your pathetic, sloppy tax fraud. You are on your own." Brittany ignored her husband's frantic shouting and addressed me directly through the speaker system. "Sydney, listen to me very carefully," Brittany said, her tone dripping with calculated malice. "That service elevator is an older analog model. Trevon installed the exact same freight elevators in his flagship luxury car dealership. I know the emergency manual override code for the pneumatic braking system. I can give you the 6-digit PIN to release the brakes and drop that car straight down to the basement level." My heart hammered against my ribs. I had the hospital locked down digitally, but Trevon had forced the analog emergency brake when he pried the doors open. If I tried to move the car electronically without that physical override code, the cables could snap and send my baby plummeting into the concrete foundation. "What do you want, Brittany?" I asked, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I want complete legal immunity from your corporate lawyers," Brittany demanded quickly. "I want your promise that you will not sue me for the money Brenda stole, and I want you to unfreeze my personal checking account right now. You give me my money and a clean slate, and I will give you the code to get your daughter back." Trevin screamed into the elevator camera, cursing his wife, banging his heavy fists against the steel doors in absolute desperation. I did not hesitate for a single second. I leaned closer to the microphone. "You have my word, Brittany," I stated clearly. "I promise I will not sue you, and I will not touch your personal checking accounts. Give me the code right now." Brittany rattled off a 6-digit numerical sequence. I immediately punched the numbers into the master console override terminal. The system flashed bright green. The analog lock was successfully disengaged. "Hold on tightly, Trevon," I whispered into the microphone. "It is a very long way down." I hit the release execution key. On the security feed, the elevator car violently lurched. The emergency brakes disengaged completely, and the metal box plummeted down the concrete shaft. Trevon was thrown to the floor, dropping his weapon, as the car fell in a controlled but aggressive drop straight toward the hospital basement. I grabbed my security badge and sprinted out of the control room. I flew down the emergency stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time, my lungs burning as I raced toward the sub-level loading dock. By the time I burst through the heavy basement doors, the heavily armed Atlanta Police SWAT team had already secured the entire perimeter. The heavy steel doors of service elevator number 3 had been forcefully pried open by tactical officers. Trevin was pinned face down on the cold concrete floor, a heavily armored officer driving a knee into his back while locking thick metal cuffs around his wrists. His luxury designer shirt was torn to shreds and he was sobbing pathetically as they dragged him to his feet. But I did not care about him. My eyes locked onto the clear plastic hospital bassinet, pushed safely into the corner of the hallway by a tactical medic. I ran to it, my legs shaking so violently I nearly collapsed. I scooped Lily up into my arms. She was perfectly safe, wrapped tightly in her pink swaddle, completely oblivious to the absolute terror that had just unfolded. I buried my face in her soft blanket, letting out a heavy, shuddering breath as the SWAT commander assured me the threat was neutralized. I held my daughter tightly against my chest and walked back up to the main lobby, surrounded by a protective wall of police officers. As the sliding glass doors opened, I saw a familiar, furious figure pacing near the hospital entrance. Brittany had taken an expensive rideshare straight from her motel to the hospital, desperate to collect her reward. When she saw me walking out completely unharmed with Lily in my arms, a smug, victorious smile spread across her face. "I held up my end of the bargain," Brittany announced, crossing her arms and blocking my path to the parking lot. "Trevon is going away forever, and I am washing my hands of him. Now tell your corporate lawyers to release my checking account and sign my immunity paperwork. I want my money, Sydney." I stopped walking. I looked at the woman who had mocked me, bullied me, and lived off stolen wealth her entire life. I looked at the sister-in-law, who had only decided to save my baby when she realized she could squeeze a final payout out of the situation. A slow, icy smile crept onto my face. "I am a woman of my word, Brittany," I said smoothly, shifting Lily comfortably in my arms. "I promised that my corporation would not sue you. I promised I would not touch your personal checking account." Brittany's smug smile faltered slightly as she noticed 2 men in dark windbreakers stepping out from behind my armored SUV. However, I continued, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "I never said the Federal Bureau of Investigation would not." The 2 men approached Brittany, pulling golden badges from their pockets. "Brittany, you are under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and complicity in money laundering," the lead FBI agent stated firmly, grabbing her arm. Brittany gasped in absolute horror as the agent forced her hands behind her back. "You lied to me!" she shrieked, kicking wildly as the steel cuffs snapped shut around her wrists. "You promised me immunity. I promised you civil immunity from my company." I corrected, stepping right into her face so she could hear every single word clearly. But when you called the security desk to sell out your husband, you admitted on a recorded line that you knew exactly how Trevin ran the analog freight elevators at his dealership, the same dealership he used to launder millions of dollars. You just confessed to having intimate operational knowledge of his criminal enterprise. Brittany's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic as the reality of her own massive stupidity crashed down on her. "Enjoy federal prison, Brittany," I said, turning my back on her for the last time. "I hear they do not allow designer hair extensions." Gavin was a cornered rat, and cornered rats are predictably desperate. With his mother sitting in a maximum security holding cell, his brother-in-law in federal custody, and his sister detained by the FBI, Gavin had absolutely no money and no leverage left. But he still had his massive fragile ego and a terrifying ability to play the victim. He knew he could not beat me in a court of law, so he decided to try and destroy me in the court of public opinion. Less than 24 hours after the hospital lockdown, Gavin secured a live guest spot on a wildly popular, highly controversial internet broadcast. The show catered exclusively to disgruntled men and thrived on generating toxic viral outrage. It was the absolute perfect platform for a man like Gavin to spin his web of pathetic lies. I sat at the head of my executive desk in the Apex CyberSec headquarters, holding a sleeping Lily safely in my arms. On the massive flat-screen monitor mounted to my wall, I watched the live video feed of my cheating bankrupt husband, performing the greatest acting job of his entire life. Gavin sat in a leather chair in the slick broadcasting studio, wearing a cheap wrinkled shirt to make himself look impoverished and broken. He leaned into the high-end microphone and actually managed to squeeze out real tears. Broadcasting live to an audience of over 3 million viewers, Gavin completely rewrote our entire history. He looked directly into the camera and painted me as a cold, calculating sociopathic billionaire. He told the host that I had maliciously hidden my immense wealth from him for our entire marriage specifically to entrap him. He claimed that I was a corporate tyrant who used my money and hacker connections to frame his sweet, innocent mother for child abuse. He sobbed as he told the audience that I had fabricated federal evidence to destroy his brother-in-law out of pure spite. And then, he delivered his most disgusting lie of all. He cried that I had used my private security team to forcefully kidnap his newborn daughter and threatened to have him killed if he ever tried to see her again. It was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. Gavin played the helpless, loving father destroyed by an evil, ultra-wealthy feminist to absolute perfection. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The live chat streaming next to the video feed was moving so incredibly fast, it was just a blur of text. The internet mob was fully activated and they were out for my blood. Social media platforms were instantly flooded with viral clips of Gavin crying. Trending topics demanded that my company be investigated. People were calling for boycotts, tagging federal agencies, and demanding that I be arrested for parental kidnapping. Inside my office, the atmosphere was chaotic. My director of public relations, a highly experienced crisis manager named David, was pacing furiously across the expensive carpet. His tablet was buzzing nonstop with alerts from news outlets asking for corporate statements. "Sydney, we are taking a massive reputational hit right now," David warned, his voice tight with anxiety. "The company's stock is going to dip if this trends for another hour. We need to issue a formal, aggressive press release immediately. We need to deploy our legal team to the studio and slap the host and his entire podcast network with a massive defamation lawsuit and a cease and desist order before Gavin says anything else." I looked away from the monitor and gently adjusted the pink blanket wrapped around my peacefully sleeping daughter. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I did not feel threatened by millions of angry strangers on the internet. They were reacting to a ghost story told by a desperate fraud, and I knew exactly how to silence the room. "Sit down and take a breath, David," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any stress. "We are not issuing a standard public relations statement. We are not sending a cease and desist letter to the studio. That is exactly what Gavin wants. He wants a drawn-out legal battle in the public eye so he can milk the victim narrative for donations and sympathy." David stopped pacing and stared at me. "Then what do we do? He is broadcasting to millions of people right now." I smiled, shifting my gaze back to my computer terminal. I typed a rapid sequence of commands bypassing my standard desktop interface and logging directly into my top-tier offshore financial portal. When you have a pest problem in a building, you do not ask the landlord nicely to fix it. I explained, my fingers flying across the glowing keyboard. You just buy the building and demolish it yourself. I pulled up the corporate registration data for the podcast network. The host did not own his show outright. He was contracted under a larger independent digital media conglomerate based out of Texas. The parent company had been struggling with low ad revenue for the past 3 quarters. They were highly vulnerable. I opened a direct encrypted communication channel with my senior acquisitions team. I gave them one simple, incredibly aggressive directive. I wanted total controlling ownership of that media conglomerate, and I was willing to pay 30% over market value to execute the hostile takeover immediately. Within 12 minutes, the deal was struck. I authorized a massive 8-figure wire transfer directly from my private holding company. The digital contracts were signed, stamped, and legally binding before Gavin even finished his second sob story on the live feed. I turned my chair to face my stunned public relations director. "Call off the lawyers, David," I instructed, standing up and handing Lily carefully to her trusted private nanny. "We do not need to sue that podcast network anymore. As of 60 seconds ago, I legally own it." I grabbed my tailored suit jacket from the back of my chair and slipped it on my eyes, locking onto the live feed where Gavin was currently begging the audience for legal defense donations. "Have my driver bring the car to the front." I ordered, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. "I am going to pay my new employees a surprise visit, and I am going to cancel this show permanently live on the air." The drive to the broadcasting studio took less than 20 minutes. I sat in the back of my armored vehicle, watching the live feed on my phone as Gavin continued to spin his pathetic web of lies. He was currently weeping, dabbing at his dry eyes with a tissue, telling the millions of viewers that he only wanted to be a good father to his little girl. He claimed my corporate lawyers were actively hunting him down to silence him. He had absolutely no idea how right he was about the hunting part. But I did not need lawyers to silence Gavin. I was going to do it myself. The studio was located in a sleek, renovated industrial warehouse in downtown Atlanta. My driver pulled right up to the front entrance. I stepped out, flanked by 2 members of my elite security detail. I marched through the glass doors and walked directly past the front reception desk. A panicked studio manager rushed out of a side office, waving a clipboard and shouting that this was a closed set. I did not even slow my pace. I simply handed him the digital acquisition papers I had printed just moments before leaving my office. I watched the color completely drain from his face as he realized the woman walking past him was the new legal owner of his entire media conglomerate. He dropped his clipboard and stepped aside without uttering another word. I approached the heavy, soundproof doors of the main broadcasting room. The glowing red on-air sign illuminated the dark hallway. I did not wait for a commercial break. I pushed the heavy acoustic doors wide open and stepped directly onto the brightly lit set. Gavin was sitting in a plush leather armchair, leaning into a high-end studio microphone. He was mid-sentence, complaining about how family courts always favored wealthy, manipulative women. The moment he heard the doors open, he turned his head. When Gavin saw me standing in the studio, his voice completely died in his throat. His jaw dropped. The fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The podcast host, a loud and aggressively arrogant man who made a living attacking women, immediately stood up. He pointed a furious finger at me, shouting at his production crew to cut the cameras and call security to throw the crazy woman out. I did not break my stride. I walked right up to the host's broadcasting desk and slammed a high-definition tablet onto the glass surface. "Keep the cameras rolling," I commanded, my voice projecting perfectly through the studio microphones and out to the millions of people watching live, "and nobody is calling security." As of exactly 14 minutes ago, my private holding company purchased the parent conglomerate that owns this entire podcast network. I am your boss. You work for me now. If you cut this live feed, you and your entire production crew are fired, effective immediately. The host froze. He looked at the control booth behind the glass. The studio manager had just walked in and gave the host a frantic, terrified nod, confirming that every word I said was absolute truth. The host slowly sat back down, completely powerless in his own studio. I turned my attention to Gavin. He was sweating profusely, gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He looked like a deer trapped in the headlights of a freight train. "You wanted a massive public audience, Gavin," I said, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "You wanted to broadcast our family business to millions of strangers on the internet. I think that is a fantastic idea. But if we are going to tell a story, we are going to tell the truth." I looked at the host and pointed at the tablet. "Plug that tablet into your main broadcasting feed and mirror the screen to the live stream right now." The host did not argue. He fumbled with a high-speed cable connecting my tablet directly to the studio's main switcher. The massive digital monitors behind the desk flickered, and my screen was instantly broadcast to over 3 million viewers worldwide. I pressed play on this first file. The crystal-clear 4K resolution video from the nursery camera filled the screens. The entire internet watched in absolute horror as Brenda sneaked into the dimly lit room. They watched her crush adult sedatives and sweep the heavy powder directly into my newborn baby's formula. The live chat, which had been actively supporting Gavin just 2 minutes ago, suddenly stalled in collective shock. Then the video skipped forward. The viewers saw me holding my crying baby. The studio speakers amplified the sharp, violent crack of Brenda's hand striking my face. They heard Brenda's vicious voice commanding me to shut the baby up so Gavin could sleep. They heard the sickening thud of Lily hitting the hardwood floor. And worst of all, they heard Gavin groaning from the bed, complaining about his business pitch, and telling me to take my unconscious infant out of the room because she was annoying him. Gavin scrambled backward in his chair, tearing his microphone off his collar. He stammered wildly, waving his hands at the cameras, screaming that the video was a deep fake, that I had used artificial intelligence to frame his innocent mother. I did not let him finish his pathetic lie. I tapped the tablet screen again, opening an audio file I had extracted from his encrypted corporate phone last week. "Let us listen to the grieving devoted father talk about his family," I announced. The audio recording played through the studio system. It was a phone call between Gavin and his mistress Amber. The audience listened to Gavin laughing arrogantly. They heard him explicitly outline his plan to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars from his startup into a Cayman Islands account. They heard him promise Amber that he was going to abandon his freeloader wife and his crying baby to move into a luxury penthouse with her. The live chat scrolling on the studio monitors completely exploded. The viewers turned on Gavin instantly. The very audience he had tried to weaponize against me was now tearing him to absolute shreds in real time. They called him a monster, a fraud, and a pathetic coward. The chat moved so fast, it was a continuous blur of pure, unadulterated outrage directed entirely at him. Gavin was hyperventilating. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his cheap shirt. He looked around the studio, realizing there was absolutely no escape from the public execution I had just orchestrated. His reputation was not just damaged, it was permanently globally eradicated. I walked around the desk and stepped directly into Gavin's personal space. The cameras captured every single second of his utter humiliation. I leaned over him and grabbed the studio microphone he had dropped on the table, holding it close to my mouth. "I promised I would let you face the consequences of your own actions, Gavin." I whispered coldly into the microphone, making sure my voice was the only thing the millions of viewers could hear. I looked down at his shaking, defeated form. "Gavin, check your email." Gavin swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically. With trembling, clumsy fingers, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. The screen lit up with a single high-priority notification. I watched his eyes scan the subject line of the email. It was a direct formal communication from the United States Department of Justice. Gavin let out a weak, agonizing gasp. The smartphone slipped from his trembling hands, hitting the studio floor with a sharp crack. It was an official federal indictment for massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement against his startup. The walls had completely closed in, and Gavin finally realized he was never walking out of this nightmare. The federal indictment for massive wire fraud hit the news cycle, instantly turning Gavin into a global pariah. His startup was dead, his reputation was eradicated, and his financial accounts were completely frozen by the government. I sent my elite corporate legal team to the cheap, run-down motel room where he was hiding the very next morning. They handed him a thick stack of divorce papers. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. He would sign away all parental rights to Lily, accept zero alimony, and walk entirely out of our lives. In exchange, I offered him a golden ticket. I promised I would not hand over the specific internal financial ledgers from my company that would guarantee him a 20-year federal prison sentence instead of a standard 5-year plea deal. It was the most generous exit strategy a ruined man could ever hope to receive. But a cornered rat is rarely logical. Gavin tore the divorce papers in half right in front of my lead attorney. He refused to sign a single page. He knew his life as a wealthy tech founder was permanently over, and his only remaining goal in the universe was to torture me. He formally demanded a full, highly publicized family court trial and aggressively petitioned for 50% custody of Lily. He had absolutely no interest in actually being a father. He just knew that threatening to take my baby was the only weapon he had left to inflict pain. I was not worried. Gavin was completely broke, publicly disgraced, and facing a massive federal trial. His mother was sitting in a county jail cell awaiting prosecution for felony child abuse. His brother-in-law was locked up by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Any rational family court judge would take one look at Gavin's catastrophic criminal record watch, the high-definition video of his mother assaulting me, and immediately strip him of his parental rights. But I severely underestimated the depth of the corruption deeply embedded in my husband's fake family legacy. We arrived at the downtown Atlanta family courthouse 3 days later for an emergency custody hearing. The man sitting behind the elevated wooden bench was Judge Clayton. He was a veteran of the family court system, a man with a stern reputation and absolute authority. My legal team confidently presented the towering stack of evidence against Gavin. We provided the video of the child abuse, the audio recordings of Gavin plotting to abandon his family, and the official Department of Justice documentation of his pending federal indictment. I sat at this plaintiff table fully expecting the judge to slam his gavel and grant me sole permanent custody on the spot. Instead, Judge Clayton completely ignored the mountain of undeniable evidence. He waved his hand dismissively at my lead attorney, claiming that criminal indictments were not formal convictions, and that every man deserved the presumption of innocence in his courtroom. He looked down at me with cold, dead eyes and stated that a newborn child desperately needs a relationship with her father to develop properly. With a swift, heavy strike of his gavel, Judge Clayton issued a temporary legal order, granting Gavin supervised weekend visitations with Lily, starting this upcoming Saturday. My lawyer was absolutely stunned. He immediately jumped to his feet and objected, citing Gavin as an extreme flight risk and a documented danger to the infant. Judge Clayton aggressively threatened to hold my lawyer in contempt of court and ordered us to immediately vacate his courtroom. Gavin turned to look at me as he walked toward the exit, a sick, victorious smile spreading across his scratched and bruised face. He had won the battle. He legally had the right to hold my daughter in just 4 days. I walked out of the courthouse, my hands shaking with a mixture of terror and white-hot rage. I knew Gavin had zero money to bribe a sitting judge, but his late father had been a wildly wealthy and highly connected corporate titan in Atlanta. As soon as I got into the back of my armored vehicle, I accessed the historical financial archives of Gavin's family trust. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the hidden connection. 15 years ago, Gavin's late father had heavily funded Judge Clayton's initial political campaign through a complex series of anonymous shell companies. Gavin had cashed in a massive generational favor. He had called in a debt from a highly corrupt judge just to maintain his malicious grip on my child. I went straight home and walked directly into the nursery. Lily was sleeping soundly in her crib, completely safe and blissfully unaware of the legal war raging around her. I stood over her, gently resting my hand on her soft pink blanket. The thought of Gavin, a desperate and broke fugitive facing federal prison holding my baby, even under state supervision, made my blood run completely cold. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. He could easily overpower a state-appointed social worker, take my daughter and disappear across the border before the police even knew he was gone. I was never going to let that man anywhere near my child. Standard legal rules were failing because the justice system was being actively manipulated by a corrupt official. If the law could not protect my daughter, I was going to completely dismantle the law itself. I kissed Lily on the forehead, instructed my heavily armed security team to lock down the estate, and drove straight back to the Apex Cybersec headquarters in the dead of night. I bypassed my standard executive office on the top floor and took the private elevator directly down to the sub-basement. This was the highly restricted temperature-controlled server farm that housed the deepest, darkest digital archives of my cybersecurity empire. I sat down at the master terminal, the blue light from the massive screens reflecting in my eyes. My fingers hovered over the glowing mechanical keyboard. Judge Clayton thought he was untouchable behind his wooden bench. He thought his dirty secrets were safely buried in the past. I initiated a targeted deep web trace on every single offshore financial account, encrypted communication and property deed tied to the judge's name. I was going to find the exact piece of leverage I needed to completely and utterly crush him. I initiated a targeted deep web trace on every single offshore financial account, encrypted communication, and property deed tied to the judge's name. I was going to find the exact piece of leverage I needed to completely and utterly crush him. My fingers flew across the glowing mechanical keyboard in the freezing temperature-controlled server farm beneath my corporate headquarters. As the founder of a top-tier cybersecurity firm, I had unrestricted access to global banking nodes and financial registries that most law enforcement agencies could only dream of. I ran a cross-reference algorithm, comparing Judge Clayton's historical financial footprint with the unredacted digital ledgers I had already extracted from Trevin's luxury car dealership. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. Judge Clayton was not just cashing in an old political favor from Gavin's late father. The corruption was active, continuous, and incredibly lucrative. The judge had accumulated a massive, crippling gambling debt with a highly illegal offshore syndicate based in Macau. To pay off that syndicate, without alerting the Internal Revenue Service, he had been accepting heavy bribes. And the dark money washing those bribes clean came directly through the ghost inventory at Trayvon's luxury car dealership. The very same money laundering operation the federal agents were currently tearing apart. I printed every single wire transfer, every encrypted email correspondence, and every fake vehicle identification number tied to the judge's hidden shadow accounts. I placed the towering stack of documents into a thick, unmarked black folder. The next morning, I did not wait for the family court building to open to the general public. I wore my sharpest tailored suit and drove straight to the downtown Atlanta courthouse. I bypassed the standard security lines by flashing my high-level corporate credentials and walked directly into the private restricted hallway reserved exclusively for judicial chambers. I pushed open the heavy oak door to Judge Clayton's private office without knocking. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, sipping his morning coffee and reviewing case files. He looked up, his face instantly turning a deep shade of red with absolute outrage at the sudden intrusion. "What do you think you are doing?" he demanded, standing up abruptly and pointing a shaking finger toward the door. "You are an active plaintiff in my courtroom. This is a highly illegal communication. Get out of my chambers right now before I have my bailiff arrest you for contempt and throw you in a holding cell." I did not blink. I calmly walked right up to his desk, pulled the heavy black folder from my leather tote bag, and dropped it directly onto his pristine desk blotter. The loud thud echoed in the quiet office. "I strongly suggest you sit back down and open that folder, Judge Clayton," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and perfectly steady. "Because if I walk out of this room, my next stop is the United States Department of Justice, and you will be trading your judicial robes for a federal prison uniform." He glared at me, his chest heaving with indignation, but the utter freezing certainty in my voice made him hesitate. He slowly reached down, opened the black cover, and began to read. I watched his arrogant, authoritative demeanor completely disintegrate in less than 15 seconds. The blood drained entirely from his face as his eyes scanned the highlighted offshore routing numbers and the absolute proof of his illegal gambling debts. "You took hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes," I explained coldly, standing over him like an executioner. "And you laundered that dirty money straight through my brother-in-law's luxury car dealership. You deliberately granted custody rights to a desperate, bankrupt fugitive just to protect your own criminal exposure. You thought I was just a bitter, helpless housewife you could easily bully from the bench. But I am the founder of the cybersecurity firm that currently possesses the raw data of your entire financial existence. Judge Clayton sank heavily into his leather chair. He looked like a deflated balloon. His hands trembled violently as he stared at the paper trail that guaranteed his absolute destruction. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice stripped of all its former power and arrogance. I leaned over the desk, planting my hands firmly on the polished wood. "You are going to recuse yourself from my custody case immediately," I demanded. "You will file the official paperwork this morning, citing an unexpected conflict of interest. And then tomorrow you are going to publicly announce your immediate permanent retirement from the bench due to sudden health issues. If you ever try to practice law or influence another family court decision again, I will release this entire dossier to the federal authorities and the national press. Recuse yourself from my case and retire tomorrow, or this goes to the Department of Justice." He swallowed hard, staring at the undeniable evidence of his crimes. He knew I held absolutely all the cards and that his career was permanently over. He slowly opened his desk drawer, pulled out a formal judicial recusal form, and signed his name with a shaking hand. By noon, the legal landscape had completely shifted. Gavin's sleazy defense lawyer received the official notification. Judge Clayton had abruptly stepped down from the case, and a new, notoriously strict and completely impartial judge was assigned to our docket. The new judge took one single look at Gavin's heavily documented federal wire fraud indictment, watched the high-definition video of the hospital assault, and instantly revoked Gavin's supervised visitation rights. He issued an emergency permanent restraining order, protecting me and Lily from Gavin and his entire family. Gavin's malicious legal strategy completely imploded in a matter of hours. The corrupt shield he had bought and paid for was gone forever. With no access to the family trust, no startup company to hide behind, no mistress to fund his lifestyle, and the federal government actively preparing to drag him into a massive criminal trial, Gavin was completely out of options. He was a ruined, desperate man with absolutely nowhere left to run and nowhere left to hide. That night, a massive, violent thunderstorm rolled through Atlanta. The rain came down in heavy, accompanied by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the high windows of my heavily fortified estate. I was sitting comfortably in my home office, reviewing the final corporate takeover documents for his former company, when the encrypted security tablet on my desk lit up with an exterior perimeter alert. I tapped the screen, bringing up the live night vision feed from the front gate cameras. There was Gavin. He had no car. He must have walked for miles from whatever cheap couch he was crashing on. He was standing in the pouring rain, completely soaked to the bone, shivering violently in the freezing cold. He was gripping the heavy iron bars of my front gate, looking directly up at the security camera. As the bright lightning flashed, illuminating his pathetic, bruised, and exhausted face, I watched my arrogant husband slowly sink down into the mud. He dropped to his knees, crawling in the rain, crying hysterically and begging the camera for a plea deal. I sat in the warmth of my home office watching the live security feed as Gavin sobbed in the freezing rain. He clutched the heavy iron bars of my front gate, begging the camera for mercy, begging for a deal. I did not buzz him in. I did not offer him a warm towel or an ounce of sympathy. I simply pressed a button on my intercom and instructed my heavily armed guards to walk out into the storm and hand him a single business card. I told Gavin through the outdoor speaker that if he wanted to negotiate his pathetic life, he would be at my lead attorney's office at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. If he was 1 minute late, I was going to let the federal government bury him alive. The atmosphere inside Mr. Pierce's downtown law firm the following morning was absolutely freezing. I sat at the head of the polished glass conference table wearing a sharp-tailored designer suit, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. Gavin walked into the room looking like a hollow walking corpse. His clothes were deeply wrinkled, likely the exact same garments he had worn while crawling through the mud outside my estate. He had dark, heavy bags under his bloodshot eyes. He had lost his stolen company. His mother was rotting in a county jail cell. His fake sister was in federal custody, and his corrupt legal shield had been completely obliterated. His entire life was a smoking crater. Gavin slumped into the leather chair directly across from me. He looked at Mr. Pierce, then at me, his hands shaking violently on the glass surface. He tried to speak, attempting to muster some pathetic remnant of his former arrogance. He begged for a quiet financial settlement. He asked for just enough money to secure a defense lawyer and flee the state, promising he would drop his custody petition and leave me alone. I placed my coffee cup down and slid a thick, legally binding document across the table. We are not negotiating a severance package, Gavin. I said, my voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. I am offering you a choice between bad and catastrophic. I watched his bloodshot eyes dart nervously toward the legal document. I explained my terms with clinical precision. I told him that the Department of Justice already had enough evidence from his bankrupt startup to secure a standard wire fraud conviction. He was currently looking at a plea deal that would put him in a minimum security federal camp for about 5 years. But as the founder of Apex Cybersec, I held the master decryption keys to his hidden Cayman Islands accounts. I possessed the specific unredacted corporate ledgers that proved he had actively embezzled investor funds across international borders. If the federal prosecutors received those specific highly classified files, I explained smoothly, his charges would immediately upgrade. He would not be looking at 5 years in a minimum security camp. He would be facing a mandatory 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I pointed at the document resting under his trembling hands. That is a full, irrevocable relinquishment of all parental rights. You are going to sign away every single legal claim you have to Lily. You will never see her, you will never speak to her, and you will never be legally recognized as her father again. If you sign that paper right now, I will personally guarantee that I will not hand over those encrypted ledgers to the federal prosecutors. Gavin stared at the termination of parental rights form. The reality of his complete and utter defeat finally crushed whatever miserable fight he had left in him. He broke down. He wept openly, sobbing into his hands right there in the pristine conference room. He realized he was signing away the only piece of leverage he had left in the world, surrendering his own flesh and blood just to save his own skin. He picked up the heavy metal pen provided by Mr. Pierce. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold it straight, but he pressed the black ink to the paper. He signed his name fully and permanently, surrendering my daughter to me, ensuring she would be safe from his toxic family forever. I pulled the document back across the table. I checked the signature, making sure every single page was properly initialed and legally binding under state law. I handed the file to Mr. Pierce, who immediately stamped it with his official notary seal, locking Gavin out of our lives permanently. Gavin looked up at me, wiping his red, tear-stained face with the back of his dirty sleeve. He asked me if we had a deal, demanding to know that the encrypted financial files would stay locked inside my corporate vault. I stood up from the table, smoothing out the front of my jacket. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man who had once allowed his cruel mother to assault me while I was holding our newborn child. I gave you my word, Gavin, I said smoothly, a cold, predatory smile creeping onto my face. I promised that I personally would not hand those specific financial documents over to the federal government, and I will honor that promise. I paused, letting the dead silence hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the final fatal blow. But my corporate board of directors held an emergency vote at 8 o'clock this morning. They decided they had a strict legal and ethical obligation to comply with ongoing federal investigations. I am not handing the documents over, Gavin, because my board of directors already did. Gavin let out a horrific, suffocating gasp. He stumbled backward out of his chair, realizing I had played him to absolute perfection. He turned and bolted out of the conference room doors, sprinting toward the lobby elevators in a blind, terrified panic. But he did not even make it out of the building. The moment the lobby elevator doors slid open on the ground floor, 6 federal agents in dark windbreakers and tactical gear were waiting for him. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in the high-rise office, sipping my coffee, and watched with profound, unparalleled satisfaction as they dragged my ex-husband out to a waiting armored vehicle in heavy steel handcuffs. The wheels of federal justice grind, exceedingly fine, especially when they are oiled with perfectly encrypted, unredacted financial data. Following Gavin's highly public arrest in the lobby of my corporate headquarters, the dominoes I had painstakingly arranged began to fall with spectacular, deafening speed. There were no prolonged, drawn-out legal battles. There were no dramatic last-minute appeals. When you hand the United States Department of Justice a silver platter of absolute, Undeniable digital proof, the resulting trials are nothing more than a swift, brutal formality. 4 months later, I found myself sitting in the front row of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. I wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. I was not there as a victim seeking closure. I was there as an architect watching the final construction of my masterpiece. The sentencing hearings had been grouped closely together by the prosecutors, turning the entire week into a rapid-fire exhibition of absolute consequences. Brenda was the very first to face the judge. The woman who had proudly paraded around my home for years wearing expensive silk robes and dripping with arrogant entitlement was now shivering in a drab, oversized county jail jumpsuit. Her perfectly dyed blonde hair had grown out into a stark, tangled gray mess. During her sentencing, the prosecutor played the high-definition nursery video one final time. The sharp sound of her slapping me and her callous, vicious words about silencing my baby echoed through the silent courtroom. The judge did not show a single ounce of mercy. He looked down at her with pure disgust and handed down a maximum sentence of 15 years for felony child abuse, intentional assault, and reckless endangerment. As the bailiffs moved in to escort her away, Brenda broke down completely. She wailed desperately, calling out for Gavin, pleading for her golden boy son to do something to save her. It was the ultimate pathetic irony. She was screaming and crying for a son who was not even biologically hers, a purchased stranger who did not even bother to look in her direction as she was dragged out of the room in heavy steel chains. Next was Trevin, the flashy, loud-mouthed luxury car dealer who used to flaunt his heavy gold watches and custom-tailored suits, was now shackled at the wrists and ankles. The federal prosecutors methodically laid out his extensive network of ghost inventory, fake vehicle identification numbers, and massive offshore money laundering operations. But it was the security footage from the hospital lockdown, showing him violently attempting to kidnap my newborn daughter during his desperate escape attempt, that sealed his absolute destruction. Trevon stood before the judge, his broad shoulders slumped, tears streaming down his face as he begged for leniency. The judge was completely unmoved, sentencing him to a hard 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, the state officially seized his entire chain of luxury dealerships, auctioning off his inventory to pay back the millions of dollars he had defrauded from the government. He was stripped of every single thing that had ever made him feel powerful. Brittany followed right behind her husband. She walked into the courtroom looking absolutely unrecognizable. The designer hair extensions, the expensive makeup, and the haughty, condescending smirk were permanently gone. She looked small, terrified, and utterly ruined. She tried to argue to the judge that she was just a naive wife who had no idea how her husband made his money. But the prosecutors played the recorded audio from the hospital intercom, the exact moment where she openly admitted to knowing the operational details of Trevon's analog freight elevators to negotiate her own payout. That single greedy admission of complicity destroyed her entire defense. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in federal prison for tax evasion and financial complicity. As they led her away, she kept looking back at the gallery, searching for the wealthy socialite friends she used to boast about. Not a single one of them had shown up. She had lost her mansion, her status, and her freedom, all because she chose to defend a monster instead of doing the right thing. Finally, it was Gavin's turn. My former husband stood before the federal judge, a hollow, broken shell of the tech founder he once pretended to be. Without my anonymous funding, without his mother's stolen fortune, and without his fake family legacy to hide behind, he was nothing. The prosecution presented the pristine, unredacted corporate ledgers my board of directors had eagerly surrendered. They detailed exactly how Gavin had systematically embezzled investor funds across international borders to fund his secret lifestyle with his mistress. Gavin did not even try to mount a defense. He simply stood there staring blankly at the polished wooden table, completely defeated by the crushing reality of his own actions. The judge handed down a severe sentence of 8 years for massive wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. I was ordered to pay millions in restitution that he would never ever be able to afford. As the heavy wooden gavel slammed down, signaling the definitive end of his arrogant existence, Gavin slowly turned his head to look at me in the gallery. He had signed away his parental rights. He had lost his company. He had lost his freedom. I did not offer him a single trace of emotion. I did not gloat and I did not smile. I simply maintained eye contact until he was forced to look away, utterly humiliated and destroyed. I stood up from the wooden gallery bench and smoothed out the front of my jacket. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for the past 4 years was entirely gone. I walked out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy double doors and stepping out into the bright Atlanta sunlight. The crisp, clean air filled my lungs. I was completely unburdened. 3 months had passed since the heavy wooden gavel fell inside that federal courtroom and sealed the fates of the people who tried to destroy my life. It was a beautiful, crisp Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta. The bright morning sun reflected sharply off the towering glass facades of the city skyline, casting a warm golden glow over the busy sidewalks. I was pushing a custom luxury stroller down the paved avenue, the quiet hum of the wheels blending perfectly with the sounds of morning traffic. Inside the stroller, my daughter Lily let out a loud, joyful giggle. She was 5 months old now, perfectly healthy, completely thriving and kicking her tiny legs with absolute delight. The horrific memory of her lying motionless on the cold hardwood floor of our old house felt like it belonged to a completely different lifetime. We were entirely safe now, surrounded by a private security detail that operated with complete invisibility but absolute unwavering efficiency. I stopped for a moment to adjust the soft pink blanket tucked securely around her little shoulders. She looked up at me with bright, clear eyes, completely oblivious to the massive corporate empire she was destined to inherit. I continued my morning walk, pushing the stroller toward the grand entrance of a massive 80-story glass skyscraper that dominated the financial district. This was the primary corporate headquarters of Apex Cybersec, the company I had built from the ground up while pretending to be a lowly freelance typist. The heavily armed security guards stationed at the expansive front entrance immediately stood at attention when they saw me approaching. They stepped aside respectfully and held the heavy glass doors open for me. I walked into the sprawling, marble-floored lobby, the sharp click of my designer heels echoing with absolute authority across the room. The digital directory mounted on the massive lobby wall displayed the newly restructured corporate hierarchy. I had not just bankrupted my ex-husband. I had aggressively acquired his entire ruined startup during the federal asset liquidation auctions. I absorbed his proprietary technology, completely dismantled his toxic, arrogant corporate culture, and rebranded his entire division under the Apex umbrella. The lazy, entitled men who used to sneer in his boardroom and help him hide his financial crimes had all been terminated without severance. In their place, I installed a highly competent, ruthless, and entirely female-led executive board to manage the new acquisitions. The company was now more profitable than it had ever been, stripped of the fraudulent bloat and running with terrifying precision. I even had Gavin's old corner office completely gutted and converted into a temperature-controlled server room. I took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor, carrying Lily in my arms, while my personal assistant managed the stroller. The penthouse office suite was a sanctuary of modern luxury and absolute power. I walked into my personal office and took my seat behind a massive custom mahogany desk that commanded the entire room. The space was completely silent, a stark and beautiful contrast to the chaotic, screaming hospital hallways I had navigated just 3 months ago. A junior financial analyst stepped into the office just a moment later, moving with polite reverence. He carefully placed a steaming cup of artisan black coffee on my desk, setting down a perfectly organized stack of morning audit reports right next to it. He offered a respectful bow of his head, addressed me formally, and quietly exited the room, making sure to close the heavy acoustic doors gently behind him. I took a slow sip of the rich coffee, enjoying the absolute tranquility of my domain. I swiveled my high-backed leather chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sprawling city of Atlanta stretched out before me, miles of steel and concrete baking in the morning sun. I held my beautiful, giggling daughter against my chest and looked down at the financial empire I commanded with absolute control. I reflected on the brutal, exhausting journey that had brought me to this exact moment of victory. They had looked at my strategic silence and assumed it was weakness. They had looked at my patience and deeply believed it was submission. My mother-in-law thought she could assault me, poison my child, and simply order me out of my own home without any consequences. My husband thought he could steal my money, lock me in a false psychiatric hold, and discard me for a younger woman while keeping his fake family legacy intact. His greedy, arrogant sister and his criminal brother-in-law thought they could bully me into absolute compliance with their flashy cars and stolen wealth. They all made the fatal, catastrophic mistake of underestimating a mother who had nothing left to lose. They did not understand that a mother protecting her child from monsters does not just get mad. She gets even. She waits in the dark, she gathers her ammunition, and she systematically dismantles every single pillar of their pathetic lives. I had stripped them of their stolen wealth, their freedom, and their fake social status. I had sent them to federal prison, completely eradicated their reputations, and taken absolute control of their entire legacy. Looking out over the skyline, listening to the soft, happy sounds of my perfectly safe daughter, I realized one undeniable truth. Revenge, when served with cold hard facts, is the sweetest victory of all. Reflecting on this journey, the most profound lesson I have taken away is that our worth is never defined by the people who fail to love us properly. For a long time, being left behind at that airport made me feel like I was disposable, just excess baggage that could easily be discarded when life became too complicated. I internalized my mother's selfish choices as a direct reflection of my own value. But discovering the truth about my father and seeing the incredible lengths he went to in order to find me completely shifted my perspective. True family is not simply a matter of biological connection or a shared last name. Instead, it is built entirely on the conscious daily choice to show up for someone. My mother shared my biology, but chose her own comfort and social status over my basic safety. My father, who had been systematically pushed away, never stopped choosing me, keeping my room ready and my presents wrapped year after year. That kind of unwavering dedication is what truly makes a family. When someone walks away from you, it exposes their own profound limitations and brokenness, not your lack of worth. We all have the power to break the cycle of conditional love and surround ourselves with people who value our authentic selves. You do not have to remain trapped in the shadow of someone else's betrayal. Have you ever had to redefine what family means to you after experiencing a deep betrayal? Please share your own experiences and comment below.